Dr. Volodymyr Bilotkach. Did I pronounce that right? I
Yeah.
hope. So thank you. Associate Professor, Air Transport Management at the Singapore Institute of Technology. Also Associate Editor, Journal of Air Transport Management, and external instructor for IATA Training. So, and based in Singapore. Doctor, how are you doing? And thanks so much for joining me right now at Kambr Media.
It's my pleasure. So I guess it's good evening to you
Yeah.
and good morning for
You.
for me, given the time difference. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing reasonably well here. Well, given that as everyone, I'm kind of working from home, or rather staying at home trying to work, I'd say
Exactly.
that would be a more appropriate definition of how things are. But Singapore is sort of reopening tomorrow, more or less, with social distancing rules, limits on the number of people that can gather at one place at one time, etc., etc. But at least it's a major step up, and finally I'll be able to take my little one to a playground, or maybe the pool in our apartment complex will reopen as well.
Well, small steps to recovery in terms of daily life. So today we're going to be talking about the topic of a recent webinar that you were a guest of for the Aviation Festival Asia, and looking at what's the state of Europe-Asia flight recovery. And so obviously it seems like we're still a ways away from that. Certainly Europe is starting to have some recovery, certainly Germany. But what are you seeing, and what's the state of Europe-Asia flights right now? Is anything starting to happen, or is it still in kind of holding pattern mode?
Well, I would say something is happening, but not much. And as far as recovery goes in general, so there is more talk than action, actually. So I'm looking, for instance, at the OAG data for the number for scheduled flights. And there has been a lot of talk in Europe that, okay, we are reopening the travel within Europe from this week, which is the week of the 15th of June. Yet, I don't see much or too many flights being added, looking at the OAG data. So, for instance, since you mentioned Germany, this week, the number of flights are down by 85%. Compared to the comparable week last year. Well, the previous week it was 89%. Yeah, sure, some flights are being added, but I mean there is not much going on there. And in general, there are some kind of bright spots in Asia still. So, for instance, Chinese market has sort of recovered in terms of the number of flights quite well. So this week they are only 18, that is 18% down compared to the same week last year. Then South Korea and Japan are about 50% down or so, but everybody else is pretty much in the red. In the United States, for instance, is operating 1/3 of the flights this week compared to the same week last year. And Europe, Asia, well, and there is no kind of systematic kind of high frequency travel possible, obviously. For a number of reasons. Well, I mean, Qatar Airways is sort of keeping the market more or less alive. You can, their policy has been throughout the pandemic is that, okay, we will fly you through Doha as long as sort of on the other end, the authorities will admit you. But the truth of the matter is that, for instance, the Asian countries, they only really allow residents in. Mm-hmm. And even that goes with some restrictions. So, for instance, if I were to leave Singapore now, I would have to get a separate permission from the Singapore authorities to come back.
Wow.
Right? So, of course, because I'm not a citizen. Well, citizens, of course, would be allowed back in with the stay-at-home or quarantine sort of provisions, obviously. But, but basically, that's how it works. And I heard the rumors yesterday in the social media that on the last flight from Amsterdam to Singapore, there were only 4 people.
Wow.
Arriving.
That's, yeah, definitely very thin load factor there.
So there.
Yeah, as you said, that gradually things are starting to open up again in Singapore.
Mm.
Do you expect a similarly gradual, uh, sort of step by step moves in terms of the recovery of Europe Asia flights? As well as you said, you're seeing more activity in China. In terms of the rest of Asia, do you expect different phases of recovery, or do you expect it to be kind of once restrictions and there's a huge pent up demand for flights back and forth? What's your expectation? What are you looking to see?
Well, yeah, I did not expect much of a recovery this summer, to be honest.
Mhm.
Also, what is happening really is that here within Asia, they're trying to or Australasia rather, because they're trying to include Australia and New Zealand as well. They are trying to create some sort of a travel bubble, if you will, or sort of a series of green corridors. But the authorities in Asian countries they are very cautious about even reopening international travel within the region.
Mhm.
And I don't think we are talking about sort of reopening travel with Europe in earnest
Right.
for quite a while, because the situation is what it is, right? So
Yeah.
uh, the virus situation in Europe is, at least from the Asian government's perspective, horrible. I mean,
So most
if
European
things were like that for in Asia currently, then uh, uh, the Asian governments would not be thinking about reopening. They would be thinking about tightening restrictions.
Mhm.
So you see, there are different approaches towards kind of how do you view the situation in general
Mhm.
in the two parts of the world, and Asian governments are being more cautious than the European governments, and I'm not sure if they are talking much about sort of returning to kind of more or less
Normal.
about return to travel, right? So uh, I don't really see much reopening. Well, there will be some flights, maybe we will see adding more frequencies, some business travel, as the way the Singapore government puts it is that we will be uh, first we will be returning to essential business travel, and so I'm not even sure that the tourist traffic will be back this year.
Hmm. Not even by the
Probably
fall.
will, yeah. So probably we will see some business travel returning towards the end of this summer, maybe a gradual reopening throughout the fall, but I don't see tourist travel um, returning this year at all.
Well, once maybe then looking to 2021, which
Mhm.
certainly now more than ever feels like a long way off. When some form of recovery does happen, what shape will that look like in terms of the major routes and hubs? How do you expect those entities to be changed by all of this?
Well, I would say that the house will be the same probably. Um, so we'll still see people traveling through the Gulf, through Europe, through major European hubs. Well, one kind of unknown to me now is whether we will see some of stronger Chinese hubs.
Mhm.
It also depends on how virus is going to behave and
Yeah,
what the governments are going to be, what the government's approach is going to be.
it's still so
But
much
given that
uncertainty about the virus and how if it will be another
there are too
major.
many unknowns, but let's say assuming that sort of the virus behaves itself, so to speak, and we won't see further waves,
Best case scenario.
then one thing that I can say is that, for instance, Chinese carriers will be well poised towards probably taking a larger share of this Europe-Asia traffic than they have been taking up to now, given that it is being kind of China-led recovery currently, or Asia, kind of North Asia-led recovery, I would say. It's China, Korea, Japan that are kind of showing some good numbers currently. But there is another issue, is that travelers probably will want more direct travel,
Hmm.
uh, and so there could be some less of a demand towards kind of connecting flights. But of course, prices will be lower, so maybe that will kind of balance itself out. and so some airlines will be looking to sort of reopening the old and maybe opening new non-stop routes between Europe and Asia.
And to just touch a bit on pricing, if we can, again, I think generally people do expect pricing to be lower, but also airlines are going to have all these huge costs of complying and also making passengers feel comfortable with the hygienic state of travel. Certainly on an airplane, people are obviously still nervous about that. What's your expectation there in terms of how pricing will shape out over the next year or so? Do you expect prices to remain fairly low as demand will creep back as opposed to have this huge surge?
Well, as with everything, it kind of depends.
Yeah.
First, I expected some airlines going under, and so with that, once demand returns, I was expecting that there will be a period when prices will go up. Now I'm thinking that maybe prices will not go up that much. So what is basically happening is that, sure, the airlines will be facing somewhat higher, some cost of compliance, of which I think the biggest issue is not so much the cleaning the aircraft, the face masks, like the personal protective equipment for crew, etc. But rather, I see the biggest issue for the airlines in the potentially increasing turnaround times due to more stringent requirements potentially towards aircraft cleaning, etc. So you'll be able to use the aircraft less, and this will have an effect, obviously. Even though the Ryanair the major European low-cost carrier, keeps telling us that no, we'll be just operating as before, and we have these great filters in
right.
the aircraft which will circulate the air, etc., etc. So, well, obviously, you need to convince the passengers that it's safe to travel, and the airlines are doing that already. So we are already seeing. Well, obviously, I'm living in my own information bubble, and I'm seeing a lot of that, maybe more of that than an average potential customer. But the airlines are trying to bring the confidence back, and I think that they will. But then, obviously, that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, in terms of confidence, which kinds of business models in the airline industry do you expect to come out of this period, this challenging period, more resurgent, more stronger? Will it be the legacy flag carriers, or do you see LCCs? Like, I'm sure, as you said, Ryanair has a lot of confidence, but LCCs are also, obviously these are lower cost airlines and don't have the wherewithal that the established carriers might have in terms of cash reserves and all of that. What's your expectation?
Well, in Europe, it's actually quite the opposite. You see, Ryanair and EasyJet, they did have large LCC carriers. They had more cash actually on hand because they are more profitable in Europe than the so-called legacy carriers. But I would say that sort of the maybe more established carriers, which does not necessarily mean older carriers, are better positioned towards recovery. And so when I say kind of more established carriers, for instance, Ryanair has been around for at least a couple of decades and has earned its reputation for being basically as safe as anybody else. And I don't see why they won't be able to to recover quite well. So I guess the sort of reputation of the carrier in terms of safety, customer service, etc., will play a more important role than the airline's business model.
Okay, and one last question. In terms of looking past this crisis period to sometime next year, what do you think that will be the main drivers of the future of the market between Europe and Asia? Will it be who can prove that they have the safest, most hygienic airline? Will it be the lowest prices? What do you see will be kind of the main drivers that airplanes going back and forth between Europe and Asia will be kind of focusing on?
Well, I think price will still play a role, obviously, but from my perspective, it's going to be more of an sort of the holistic of sort of value that the airline delivers to the customer in terms of the price, the service quality, and obviously kind of safety and security. So these are essentially the same components as before, but potentially kind of the safety security will have a larger weight attached to it than it had before the pandemic. But from my perspective, an important issue will be sort of whether and how the governments will be talking, and what kind of an agreement they're going to reach on sort of, well, essentially on conditions of travel in terms of the requirements for tests, for sort of quarantine or stay at home sort of requirements at the destination, etc. And I did not, at least I do not see much of that happening on my radar, which kind of worries me a bit, because obviously governments have other things on their plate currently, but unless they sort of talk to their counterparts, it will be very difficult for the airlines to resume flying and for passengers to actually have confidence to travel.
Well, that certainly maps out, even with all the uncertainties, a few certain aspects of the current challenge and where it's going. So, Volodymyr, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll keep following up on seeing how the market between the two regions develops. Thanks so much.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for your call.